Hello everyone, my name is Julia Nolan and I'll be doing my final history project on the women's suffrage movement. So my question was, what motivations began the start of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, and how did this eventually lead to the 19th Amendment? So we have to do a little bit of background. So what was the women's suffrage movement? It was a decade-long fight for the right to vote. But it was more than that. By giving women the right to vote, also gave them a sense of identity. Women wanted and needed, more specifically, a political identity outside of their family, their house, their home, their husband. And eventually this did happen. So on August 18th in 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified in the United States Constitution, giving all women the right to vote. Alright, so before the Civil War, which is when the women's suffrage started, it was more talked about and very much lost attention because of the war. But eventually, because of the war, the 15th and 14th Amendment was ratified, which kind of gave women more ideas and optimism and led them to establish organized groups or associations. So the 15th and 14th Amendment had a big role when it came to women's suffrage. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote and was ratified in 1869, and the 14th Amendment gave citizenship to all or naturalized in the United States and protection under their law. So it was ratified in 1868. So this leads us to the first association, and that was the National Women's Suffrage Association. And the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they opposed the 15th Amendment, and the reason they opposed the 15th Amendment was because of the exclusion of women. And so their perspectives and their output was more focused on the national action and wanted the 15th Amendment to be extended to women. So their strategies were often to send petitions to the Senate and the House of Representatives to include women in the lawmaking. Which leads me to the next association, which is the American Women's Suffrage Association, or the AWSA. And this was founded by Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, and Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And this group supported the 15th Amendment. They found the amendment more as a good, hopeful, positive aspect, because they believed that if this amendment, which gave the right for African Americans men to be allowed to be voted, then what's stopping them from being able to vote? But they also took a different approach. The reason they focused on getting access to the polls at a state and local level. The reason they wanted to focus on local levels and everything was to eventually have enough support to gain to the national level. So then there's that, but this kind of all fell apart, and later in the 1890s and the early 1900s, they established the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, and it was a combination of both the AWSA and the NWSA, and it became the largest women's suffrage organization in the country and was a leader through the early 20th century up until the 19th Amendment, obviously. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton became the president, Susan B. Anthony became the vice president, and Lucy Stone became the chairman of the executive committee. And then by combining both the American Women's Suffrage Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, it created both getting the movement out on the national and the local levels. But there were other strategies and components into the movement. More suffragist groups were formed and took on other approaches, obviously. So like marches and hunger strikes, those really helped to show how important the movement was. Other marches, one included in Washington, D.C. with thousands of women attending. And then one of the first ever picket was outside the White House in 1917, and it showed women standing in signs with signs to show support for the movement. And they would often, it would get a lot of attention, but it often led to the arrest and hunger strikes in the prison because, again, they were incarcerated, and this probably happened to over hundreds of women. So, and then another component that really helped, not during but after, was World War I. Women often, again, took more leadership roles in supporting the efforts of war. So women would often argue that if they could take on leadership roles to help the war effort and be patriotic just like any other man, then why don't they have the right to vote like any other man? So that was kind of the end of all of those in my research findings. So then my sources, my source 1, again, a primary source. So the source gave specific details that are important to the movement, as well as going into detail of the amendments, such as the 14th, 15th, and 19th. My second source helped better understand the American Women's Association because it explains in detail what the group was and who was in it, as well as their goals. It also broke down and gave background information on the leaders before they joined the suffrage movement and what other movements they were in. And then my source 3 was the Women's Journal, and it helped understand perspective on the movement and other women's opinions because it was often written in that journal, as well as kind of written about the aftermath of marches or the strikes that happened at the time in the bigger cities like Washington, D.C. and New York. And then my fourth one was the National American Women's Suffrage Association official website. And this again gave background on the National American Association, and it gives details of how they kind of became as well as their perspectives and how they all kind of enter and how both associations became one. So that was really, really helpful. And that's all. Thank you.